Welcome to the Alarpa Podcast, the home for cultural chit-chat in and outside Madrid. People will talk. So welcome back to the Alarpa Podcast. Joining me in studio as ever is the wonderful Mary. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Excellent. And that was your podcast. See you next week. So I just want to give a special shout out to Ola Dynenko, if I remember your surname properly. When I was 11, two girls from Belarus came over as part of the Chernobyl Children's Fund, and they spent a month in Ireland to enjoy our green fields and fresh air. So Ola and Natasha came over 2 years consecutively, and Ola and I have maintained kind of contact on and off, but now we've kind of re-established contact again. And I don't know if we've ever had a listener from Belarus on the podcast, but when I send this to her and make her listen to it because we mentioned her, she could be the very first listener from Belarus for the podcast. So that is an amazing fact. But here's to old friends and cross-cultural, multicultural friendships that stretch across national borders. So they're tripping over that word. Have you ever been to Belarus?
No, I haven't.
Neither have I. That might change though. I might go. Who knows? We could do a podcast from there. And that could be amazing. But so today we're going to talk about many different things. Primarily we're going to be talking about Russia a little bit. That'll be in part 2 of the podcast, but we're in part 1, so let's focus on that. We've mentioned previously that we have a camera from the 50s, which was very in vogue. It was mislabeled as being made in America, but in reality it was made in Spain. Mm-hmm. Your parents have had such a camera, and we have taken it. We've bought some film for it. Well, okay, we've requisitioned it, yeah. And we're going to be taking photographs of hotspots around Madrid that were famous in the 50s. For example, if you're familiar with our article on Margaret Taylor, who with her coffee shop embassy helped a lot of Jews escape from World War II, from Spain during the World War II. That would be one of the locations we're going to go to, because that was still in operation in the 50s, and a few other locations around the city. Where else are we going to? You've mentioned a few.
Well, mostly it's around the center, to be honest. Around Gran Via, for example.
Yeah, because I've heard that there are no suburbs in Madrid until the 70s. It was all city centre and nothing else.
No, that is true, yes, because even where I used to live, which was my grandmother's house, which is Nuevos Ministerios, that is smack in the centre of Madrid now.
Yeah.
Back when she got the house in the 30s, it was the fields, and all they could see was just cows outside. So
that's incredible, because Nuevos Ministerios is like very urbanized now. Yeah. So it was actually, as an incidental, there's a YouTube channel called Cinema Massacre on YouTube, hence the YouTube channel, I guess. But yesterday, the guy behind it, they're an ensemble, but I only really like one of the guys because he seems the most normal and least geeky. But he went through the cameras he used when he was a child. So he was born in the 80s, and in the 90s he used Super 8s, like very early versions of cameras that were passed down to him as well. And even one from the 50s his grandfather had given to him, where you'd like wind it and dial it up, and then you have a certain period of recording. So it's kind of fascinating to see cameras from this 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s and up to the modern ones that he makes his videos with. But this camera, what's it called again?
Fowell.
Okay, exactly.
It is called like that. It sounds like it's horrible.
Because it's Spanish, that's why. Because it's an fake American company or kind of name, which is very interesting, because we think like today maybe companies pretend to be from places to kind of sell their mystique or the exoticness of that location. But These guys were way ahead of that back in the 50s.
Yes, they were.
It's like nice little cute camera. But you have learned a little bit about it.
Yeah.
So like, fill us in. Give us the goss. Spill the coffee.
Well, the camera was my grandfather's actually, and he was a chauffeur. So he usually drove like diplomats around, and normally people that worked in embassies.
Okay.
So I reckon like I'm not entirely sure whether they gave it to him as a present or he bought it himself, because sometimes like they gave him presents to thank him, you know, for all his work. So I'm not entirely sure about that because my mom didn't remember. But the camera, it's been there for like since I remember, but nobody had tried to use it. And then, well, it just, you get the impression that it's like precisely because it's called Fowell. Like, I know it, well, I hadn't realized when you pronounce it, it sounds like it's bad. But actually the name to a Spanish ear sounds like very trendy and like it could well be American. And in fact, many people believed it was American. But then when I did a little bit of research, what I found was that basically there was a company in Spain that was called Applied Physics Fowell, which is a very strange thing even in Spanish. So not quite sure, like, you know, well, I suppose they worked on like camera lenses or things like that. But it was a random name. And there was a thing, there was like a certain situation, legal situation in the 50s in Spain, which meant that it was a type of patent called distribution patent, but it was like a legal figure that they basically made up in the dictatorship, which meant that they could copy ideas from other countries and kind of like say they were in the process of getting it approved. So what they did was like they produced tons of things that were like rip-offs of things that existed in other countries.
So they were the China of today.
Well, a little bit like that. Under that, from what I have read, under that loophole, let's say, a lot of things were marketed in Spain.
That's quite interesting because, like, as we mentioned, it was marketed as being American, which would add a chic value to it. But also, in another sense, there'd be very few, if any, imports into like isolated Spain, especially when this camera was made. So maybe it was to give the impression that foreign goods were actually entering the market when in reality they weren't. So there's like maybe that little dimension to it as well.
I think probably United States was kind of like the only exception within reason to that.
Yeah.
Just purely from the fact that we had American bases in Spain.
Yeah.
So then, you know, some other things that, including like in the 60s when Spain opened up and stuff like that, there was a huge component related to like Americans.
Okay.
And Americans that were military bases here.
Yeah. Well, I guess this wasn't in the research, so I'm not trying to catch you out or anything. But those cameras wouldn't fool an American, though, no?
No, I mean, the cameras, in fact, I mean, they're a rip-off of a camera that was like a model that was very popular in the States.
Okay.
Just with a different name. I don't think... No, well, the name... The weird thing is that then the name of the company is SA, which is like, you know, limited, but in Spanish. So it's a bit random. But it's exactly the same. But to be honest, it's not even like a high range camera, like upper range or anything like that. It's actually a really basic camera.
Okay. Okay, so fascinating stuff. Is there anything else that you can fill us in on before we go to the next part of the show?
Well, just that it seems that a lot of people had this camera in their houses. When I did a bit of research, it was, and also they produced it during a very like limited period of time, so like 20 years or something like that. You know, from the end of the war to like mid-50s, and they did other models later on, but they weren't the same as this one. other ripoffs from this company that apparently, I suppose, never knew that they were copying all their prototypes.
It's kind of funny as well because I know Franco had a reputation for opening dams constantly. They call him the frog. Now, what was it? The Franco... What's a frog in Spanish again?
Rana.
Yeah, they call him some kind of frog nickname because he jumped from dam to dam, basically inaugurating them. So he became like very synonymous with these like huge architectural projects, but in another sense he was also, I guess, associated with cheap knockoffs of American consumer goods, but he doesn't really have that fama or that fame.
No, to be honest, I don't think many people know about this. I suppose it's only thanks to the internet that these things,
surface.
Exactly, and the first person could research it because it was just somebody that did the same as me, looking for the brand and trying to find a little bit more about the history of the brand. So.
Well, thank you for giving us a snapshot of this particular camera. We will continue the podcast after this musical interlude. Part 2 of this particular show. So we're going to be discussing a book from 2005, Catherine Meredale's Ivan's War. Now, we've discussed this particular book on a previous podcast. Momentarily, we'll be expanding on that in this part of the show, but also her other book, which is about Lenin's train journey from Switzerland to Russia. By the way, when you were in Switzerland, did your brother ever take you to like Lenin memorabilia places?
Yes, because when I was there, I was reading the book.
Okay, yeah.
So I showed him, look, he mentions this place and this other place, and they weren't far off his house.
I'm sure you've taken the kudos of having that book when in reality you'd borrowed it from me.
Well, good. I know, I borrowed it, yes. What did I say? No, well, I told him that you lent it to me.
Okay, that's good. Okay, fair play. I wronged you, as we say in Ireland. You can borrow this book as well when I'm finished with it, which should be... I am finished with
You're
this.
talking to the listeners or you're talking to me? You can all borrow the book.
Yeah, Bob in Minnesota, a long-time listener, you can get that book. No, so I have finished it, but I want to read some of the annotations at the end further. But when I... have done that, you can take possession of it, which will be on Monday. So when you are in Berlin, you can read about the Russians storming Berlin.
Fair enough.
Synchronicity of sorts, I think. Okay, so you're going to ask me some questions about the book. Where do you want to start, comrade?
Okay, who's Ivan?
That's a very good question. If I said to you Fritz, Tommy, would that evoke any particular image?
Well, I suppose it's just a stereotypical name to refer to a person from a country.
Looks like someone doesn't need to borrow this book after all. Very informed. That's exactly what it is. So you're right, yeah. So the common German stereotype, I mean, for example, Ireland, it would be Paddy, but specifically in the Second World War, yeah, Fritz would be the German soldier, and the Tommies would be the British soldiers. Now, the Germans also had... the name Jerry, because the British during the Second World War had like jerry cans, which are like chamber pots underneath their beds, and as a way to kind of make fun of the Germans, they called them jerrys after the jerry can, for example. Okay. It's like calling your enemy toilet, because you wanted to strip them of any, I guess, fearsome quality. And especially in the start of the Second World War, the Germans would have had that because their blitzkrieg was very devastating. Now, also, if you're familiar with Bridge Over the River Kwai, a famous theme that they whistle. It was also very common to whistle during the Blitz as well when the German bombs were falling down, because again, you have to keep your spirits up, and you're singing about the genitalia of Hitler and Goebbels as a coping mechanism. Only one ball is what they say, and that actually has been a fixture of like a pretty passionate debate at times. And apparently, there's a book released in Germany recently as well, which speculates that Hitler's madness came from having micro genitalia. But of course, it's probably simplistic. But to go back to your question, Ivan's warrior. So Ivan, of course, was this phantom Russian soldier, or this everyman Russian soldier, I should say. Yeah. And this is interesting in two ways, because in the introduction to the book, which is quite extensive as well, Catherine Merridale really makes a case for why this book should be written. And Anthony Beaver, who's written a book about Berlin actually, and also other things about like Stalingrad and other episodes of the Second World War, calls it like a really in-depth book. Why guess what he said? I have the book here. He says, tells a searing story from the bottom up. Merridale's account of the suffering of the Red Army soldiers and their families is unlikely to be bettered. And that is not from Anthony Beaver, that's from Robert Service, so another great historian. But you can trust my analysis of the book better than my remembrance of quotes. But it is interesting for two reasons, because she does say in the introduction that, you know, this is never really done before, because in Russia, such was the power and the effects of decades of Soviets propaganda, even before the war, you know, during the war, and especially after the war. But even during the war, because I told you the other day that the first museum for the Second World War was opened in 1943 by the Russians. Like, so the war hadn't even been finished yet, but at that stage, it was more or less clear that the Nazis were only going to do one thing, and that was to lose the war. And so essentially, even after the war, this myth sprung up about the Great Red Army, the good guys against the bad guys. You know, these very simplistic, broad terms. So even she found interviewing these people, like these soldiers, they couldn't really remember what it was like to fight in the war. And this is apparently very common, because other accounts of the First World War and other engagements, they talk about how the fog of war, which normally means to, when you're in the middle of war, how killing can be messy and confusing, but also can refer to when you leave the war, and how even if you don't try to forget, the memories become this soup that's very difficult to pick out the crystal clear images of actually what happened. And it just becomes this giant feeling rather than a series of very clear memories, which is intriguing in itself. But also, like, because you had the museums, the songs, the propaganda, the state apparatus, she found that these old veterans who were quite old, they started unwittingly mixing, you know, something they might have seen in a documentary or a movie with their own kind of memories, or popular songs, for example, would form part of their memory. That's because they weren't allowed to talk about the war, even when they're fighting the war. She shows, for example, if you were in the Battle of Kursk, for example, which was a huge battle after Stalingrad, which was significant in turning the tide of the war as well, because the Germans were really good at dominating those rolling hills, especially in the summer. And the Russians really, when they were losing the early stage of the war, had to rely on the winter and the snow to slow down the Nazis. So when they turned the tide in Stalingrad, the Battle of Kursk, which was an epic battle of hundreds of tanks, you know, when they won that, you know, again, they sustained massive losses. And if you're a soldier in that battle and you were moved to another company or to another part of the war, you couldn't talk about the things that you saw or the things that happened. Or if you're in Leningrad, you know, that was a huge disaster, that you had to keep those things secret. So because of that environment, we don't really know, or we didn't know who the Russian soldier was. It was just this idea, and they saw unique things, terrible things. And Catherine Merridale in her book really does a great job of bringing these people to life, from their insecurities, their fear, and they're also their bravery, because even in the early stages of the war, when they were not really trained very well, and when they didn't have even guns, the Nazis, who saw these people as subhuman, were impressed by how they flung themselves at tanks and fought seemingly without fear. What's also interesting as well, like obviously a lot of Nazis worked for the Americans after the war, and they gave a profile of the Russians to the Americans because, of course, at this stage the Cold War was playing itself out. And again, they were talking this generic, almost beastly but brave kind of caricature of what a Russian soldier was. So for many different reasons, until this book, there's never really an accurate account of who these people were. And of course, ultimately, these people were human beings like you and me. So,
okay, that's very interesting. So, how does she go about choosing the people that are gonna be?
That's a really interesting question because I was going to say something you said in part 3 because we do record that before part 2, but because you say part 3 prediction time about the methodology of archaeology.
Okay.
Her methodology here historically is very interesting. So I don't know why she makes these choices, but what she does do is that she goes through letters. She paints really vivid pictures. I mean, for example, when the Russians invaded, she talks about how, because when the Germans invaded Russia, they attacked this town on the border first, and she talks about how the weather was good, people were at the theater, there's fireworks in the sky, it was like a big celebration. She really paints a picture of like what was happening in this particular town. She even knows a lot about like the movies that they were fed on. So even in the run up to the war, before the Second World War had started, there are really simplistic stories of the Germans being repelled by the Russians, by the Soviets, just by grit and gumption. The enemy have come over. It's like pushed them back. So she knows a lot about the general culture and what was really influencing the people at the time. What was like in the ether. I mentioned to you as well the other day that about the Battle of the Kursk, how a lot of the soldiers who survived it spoke about how hot the day was, and she says a very interesting thing. She said it wasn't a hot day; it was actually a cold day, but because of the explosions and the sheer literal fire of war and that particular battle, that's the heat they were remembering. So she goes back and traces things, even like weather reports, diary entries, and she does have a great profile of the individual soldiers that run throughout the book. There's one guy, there's one guy who's a committed communist, a Soviet. He, like in the early days of the war, it was chaotic because a lot of people like deserted the army, and this happened throughout the war as well. But also what happened was, because of the Stalinist policies of the 20s and 30s, and the Soviet policies of collectivization, forced famines, a lot of people like Ukrainians and other people who were part of the Soviet Union, I mean, you have to remember as well, like Mongolians were part of this as well, and they weren't Stalinists by any stretch of the imagination. So a lot of these people, when they were fighting in these areas, these Ukraine or whatever, a lot of them deserted. This particular gentleman, he was lost. He got separated from his battalion, and he knew the locals were very anti-Soviet, so he pretended that he was just an ordinary person, and he stayed with some farmers. He said, like, don't tell the Russians I'm here, don't tell the Germans I'm here, I'm going to work here for you if that's okay with you. And he said, okay. And then he had to listen, and he was a proud Soviet, a proud communist, about how they hated the Soviets because of what they did to their farms and everything as well. Eventually he makes his way to a partisan group, and he fights the Germans with partisans, but he's left frustrated by the Russians because they don't really send any men or guns or clothes for them, and they're kind of expected to perform heroically and do these great tasks in the name of Stalin, even though a lot of soldiers would say on the front Stalin was far from their minds, because he wasn't part of their everyday life. And then he continues fighting, survives the war, but we can see through him the local attitudes of the people. We can see, because of his diary entries, how even when he was fighting the Nazis as a partisan, how the Soviet state expected these high things, but really were very cold and didn't really care enough to support either the families of soldiers left behind, behind the front line, or to support partisans who were fighting a common enemy, the Nazis. essentially. We also know like other stories of a guy who had to leave his wife and join up, and the situation was chaotic. He had to take a train to a certain destination, and if you missed it and you didn't turn up, you were considered a deserter, and if they found you, they would arrest you and either shoot you or put you in a penal battalion, and then you'd be given the worst of the worst tasks, for example. So through like songs, through diary entries, through every conceivable piece of evidence, she paints a picture of like just ordinary people who are caught in the unbelievable irrationality of the Soviet state, and in this great dramatic backdrop, which is the Second World War, and also the great brutality of the Germans.
Okay, so right, this is not strictly related to, well, it's not a question about the book, but it's prompted by what you have just explained about the book. So how important do you think a subjective account of historical events is?
Well, I've always believed subjectivity is a good thing in history. It's not as if it's not about having a position, it's just about using the information correctly, not like inventing things or omitting things that don't fit into your narrative. So if something is biased but based on strong evidence or clear evidence, then I think that's okay. But if you are misrepresenting things just to prove a point, then that is obviously wrong. Jon Stewart, when he was on Crossfire with that great tool from Fox News, Tucker, he also said that as well, that it's not about being subjective, it's just being subjective and ignoring the facts. But why do you ask me that question?
Well, because the book is basically centered around people's experiences. So, for example, when you're talking about the fact that she did some research, presumably she saw fit to challenge the fact that they were saying it was hot. Do you know what I mean? So there was like, she was just, because she was constantly looking at personal accounts, then I think to a point she was just trying to see how subjective they were.
Well, that's a good observation, because in the introduction she talks about how she's with a research partner, and then they interview this old Russian woman who remembers being in the town when the Russians take it back from the Germans, and how this heroic Russian figure appears at the door, and she was so emotional telling the story that it would be an amazing moment for a Russian to see that. Not that it always went well. I mean, sometimes Russians stole things from the locals, and again, if it wasn't Russia itself, but maybe Poland or another country that was in the Soviet Union, maybe they wouldn't be so happy to see them. But in a lot of cases they were, because the Russians were a lot better than the Germans, because the Germans were very, very brutal. But also as well, the Russians just came out, one day the Russians are there and you just think, okay, salvation, and the Germans are gone and maybe the war will end soon. Now, but she also challenges that woman's recollection of that day. And I think she's doing it because it happened, relatively a long time ago. These people are old, but also, as I mentioned before, she knows like how they've been conditioned by the unrelenting brutality of Soviet propaganda, and I think she's trying to separate that from what actually happened and identify like what actually did occur, because she knows that these people have misremembered things. And there's just so much pollution in the air in terms of like what the official hagiography is and what actually occurred.
Well, I just think it's a very interesting approach, because at the end of the day, what goes down in history, there's always like this saying, like, history is written by the winners, and
let's stop you there for a second, because
right.
because this book is an antidote to that, because it's like the first non-official history, and she talks about how, like, for example, I mean, Band of Brothers, great, one of the early HBO classics. In the extras to that, Ron Livingston says they wouldn't allow singing in the army if it wasn't beneficial, and it's true, because singing makes you work harder and walk longer. And in the Russian army, and that was a very tough army to be in, singing was an amazing thing that was allowed, because it just, well, again, they weren't literate, so it wasn't if they were going to be reading like books or whatever. To a lot of them weren't literate, so that was like a form of entertainment, a form of how to communicate with each other. Even there's a story in the book about how this German guy in broken Russian left a note in an empty tank shell or empty shell casing, asking for the lyrics to a song. And my point is that a lot of these songs were rude or rough, but even though they happened in the official history, they didn't happen because they had to be singing like very sentimental ballads about the river and Stalin and hills and all that kind of stuff, So she really shows like this is the real experience of these people, and this is the official account that ignores this, for example. So so you're right, history is very often written by the winners, but she's digging in deep and trying to show that this is where these two accounts diverge and this is what actually happened.
Okay, well, that's precisely what I was getting at, because I think, the last thing you said, how this like differs from the official narrative, but the thing is, like, at the end of the day, the official narrative, more often than not, is propaganda all the same. So, when you look back at historical events, especially things that where there's contention, and if you think of, like, for example, the Spanish Civil War, it's the same. It's the same idea. At the end of the day, who's to say that the official narrative has any more truth than people's personal accounts? And I think, like, for me, the more obviously, there are like certain things that a historian has to look at from the outside and examine to be able to build a narrative. But I think the personal experience, whether it fits with the actual fact, for example, what you were saying about the temperature, at the end of the day is like such a valuable element in itself. Not just, it doesn't have to be exactly what happened. I don't think the aim is to make it fit the actual facts, but I think it has value in itself, and it's interesting because at the end of the day, we study history because we want to know about humans and then human experience at the end of the day. So it's in a way it's irrelevant what completely objectively happened if people didn't feel it that way.
Well, she does a good job of showing both, because you do.
I know that's very relativist.
No. It's a good point, but I think she does a good job of doing both, because like you do get a sense of like what is happening factually in terms of this is how many days Stalingrad went on for, and this is when they got pushed back, and this is the Battle of Kursk, and now they've liberated this particular town. So she does a great job of marrying the kind of historical trust of the momentum of the war, but as you said, the individual stories as well. And I think if you think of a regime giving its version of events, I think maybe most of us would think, well, I wouldn't fall for it. But because I was reading this book, I wanted to see images of the Russian front, and I YouTubed it. And the comments underneath, which again aren't great barometers of anything, but one guy was like saying, "Oh, look at the brave Russians. They all answered the call." And fought off the enemy from. I'm so proud of being Russian, and like it just shows like how that narrative, even from like a bygone communist era, the Russia today still promotes that, and I think why her book is important is because she shows that there are a lot of tensions and suspicions between the different kind of ethnic groups of the Soviet Union, of the Red Army, of the Ivans, I guess. How like the Mongolians, for example, couldn't swim, and the Russian commanders didn't care. They're forced to cross the river, and whoever died. The losses were horrific. We know, for example, that the Russians looked at the Polish with great suspicion. Anytime there was a new tank, like only the Russians could drive it, because they didn't think that the ethnic non-Russian ethnic groups would treat it carefully, and by that I mean they would probably drive it straight to the Germans, and surrender it, or fight for the Germans in their tank, for example. She shows, like, for example, before the Russians invaded or were invaded by the Nazis, how even Russian soldiers put swastikas on their helmets, And some thought, well, the Germans haven't done anything to me. Who cares, So there's like with anything, there's such a great body of people with different motivations. It just shows, the fact that they were able to turn it around, like in every sense, from like the sheer irrationality of the regime, from the brutality, from the lack of preparation, on every sense. Like soldiers in the early part of the war didn't even have enough guns, enough uniform. They didn't have socks. They had nothing really. They were using horse and carts, losing men either through them running away or getting shot in an unimaginable scale. And the fact that they're able to turn that around is also I guess the B story of the book, which is, it's just like, how did this even happen? It's just incredible. But apart from that, she just shows like that these people with their superstitions, with their Catholic faith, for example, even Muslims in there, they were also fighting in this war, treated with suspicion by their fellow soldiers. But and like that is these are the humans. This is the humanity. This is the colorful characters who fought against all odds, and a lot of those odds from their own side, to win that war. And obviously ultimately it was a good thing. Pushing Nazi Germany back and breaking the back of Hitler's army. But it's a very complex story, and very often it's told in a very simplistic black or white way, So her book is very important for that, because there's not that many accounts out there that really have done that,
Okay, that's very interesting. So thank you for giving us that fascinating analysis about the book. Is there anything else that you want to tell us about?
I just think she just populate the book with characters. You can see individual stories. She talks about like the food, what they're wearing. You mentioned this incredible detail, so you really do know what kind of movies they're watching, the plot points, the characters, the production side of it as well. There's stuff like how soldiers were insecure about their deformities if they got injured, whether their wives would still love them, what they were doing, back where they were they going off with another man, for example. So again, things common to, if you've seen A Thin Red Line, with Terrence Malick movie, I'm not a fan of it, but there's a scene where a character gets a Dear John letter, which is basically a letter for his woman saying, look, I met someone else, good luck, It's just like these kind of he's human side as well, of war, and like how families were torn apart, so I think it's just a very interesting, well told story, and I can't recommend it highly enough, because I think if you want historical information, you'll get that in spades. If you want human interest stories, you get that in spades as well, and you learn everything from, as I said, what they were wearing on their backs, the guns they were carrying, what they were thinking, what they were singing, what kind of swear words they were using, and all as the war twists and turns from Nazi ascendancy to Russian retribution and retaliation and reconquest of their own land. So it's a fantastic book.
Okay, well, I'm sure that will make everyone want to read it.
Wait, I segue into part 3.
Okay.
That's my job. That's my job.
Oh, I was about to jump in.
Okay, well, part 3.
Snoliota, spavarota, pace pivraga fustoi, Ieta biotis poliemiota, pulemiotic maladoi, Erta cianca rasta cianca, nascia gordius i crasa, Canardiskaya ta cianca, se citiria cagliesa.
So here we are in part 3 of the show, and we're almost we're in the home straight now. We're almost finished, and PewDiePie. That's just what I want to talk to you about before we finish completely.
Uh-huh.
Okay, I love your little looks, but again, podcast is not a visual medium. But you are frustrated by that reference. Why?
No, I'm not frustrated because, no, tell me.
Okay.
I know what you're going to say, I think.
Of course you do, because I've said it to you multiple times. But for the benefit of the listener who does not know me personally or in real life, no matter how much they might want that, this is like fresh information for them to their ears. Or not, who knows. But no, it's just fascinating because I won't get into this in great detail. I was actually going to do this as a podcast next week in its entirety because you're going to Berlin. But we actually have time to record a podcast before you go, so that's okay. And can you briefly tell us why you're going to Berlin?
I'm going to a conference on vernacular architecture.
Vernacular architecture?
Yes.
I actually did not know that was the topic. What is vernacular architecture?
So vernacular architecture is like the traditional architecture, or vernacular in general, the traditional things of the people before anybody comes in and invades them or strips them of their actual culture.
Very good. Very political.
There's a lot of vernacular in Ireland as well.
Of course there is, yeah. Well, that's actually, yeah, I mean, that would be very true, yeah. So, I mean, I just thought, like, archaeology was a question of layers, so you could see that pre-invasion layer in a particular place, for example, but is it something different you're doing at this conference, or just by looking exclusively at it? That's just the kind of like the hook, or what?
Okay. Do you know, like, there's a thing called a PhD that I did on vernacular architecture.
Yes, yeah.
In ancient Egypt. So I'm just talking about, like, the methodology I developed.
Okay.
So basically the conference is about vernacular architecture in general, but there's a section on, like, archaeological applications, basically.
Okay, sounds fascinating. Well, I wish you bon voyage on Monday. So yeah, PewDiePie, I just want to say a quick thing. It's incredible. I would recommend anybody who sees the newspapers, and newspapers are interesting how they deal with this guy. He's a Swedish YouTuber. He's 90 million followers online. And a lot of people aren't aware of this because, well, their life doesn't involve YouTube consumption, or if it does, they're not following a particular personality on it. Now, I kind of half watch him. I think he's interesting sometimes. But what I find is, like, a lot of people equate him with the alt-right and blame him for neo-Nazi activities. I'd love to do a more in-depth podcast about this because we don't really have much time in part 3 because that's where we just say goodbye and plug stuff. But so I just think, like, if you see an article about that saying how he's like a sympathizer for the far right, it's not true, and maybe you should wait for our podcast in the future where we kind of go into more detail about that. But it's just amazing to me how, because I've been following this kind of story for the last couple of years, how it still rumbles on, and it shows how lazy the media are, and how because whenever they write an article about them, they always kind of fall back on the same standard phrases that they use. And also how threatened they are by the digital media, because whenever they talk about things from the internet or YouTube, they always diminish it in some way or use or apply adjectives like bizarre, for example. So, for example, YouTube or PewDiePie is actually engaged in a battle of sorts with a company called T-Series. I hate describing it because it sounds so juvenile, but there are interesting things to be extracted from it. And, like, for them, it's like banter, and it's the community, which is what YouTube should be about, kind of taking the football, the meme football, and running with it, and scoring home runs with it. To extend a sporting analogy as well.
Huge metaphor.
And kind of a alluded one at that. And it's kind of like, just, they know it's an in-joke, it's ironic, but the media call it bizarre as if it's some kind of, like, weird, like, peeing contest between these two people. But in reality, there's two dimensions to it. One, that's an in-joke that people are actively participating in, and now the media also do this to an extent because HuffPost and BuzzFeed have all these, like, stupid clickbait articles, and then you click on it and you feel like crap for reading it. And it's not really participatory, but they are manipulating you to consume that content. And at least with YouTubers like him, like PewDiePie, it's at least you can actually partake and be a part of that in a fun and silly way as well. For a while he was like running a book club, and I even saw an article in the Guardian about how like he was promoting alt-right ideas, and really he wasn't, because he was just giving his honest opinion whether this book was good or not. Wasn't anything spectacular, but virtue of the fact that a guy with a mainstream audience of young people was doing that, it meant that more people were reading, you know. So he just gets a lot of unfair flack. But also what this shows is that YouTube is becoming more commercial, and T-Series is huge, like behemoth, this gigantic company who, you know, are like pumping out videos and are backed by a huge corporation, while he's like a self-made YouTube star, a millionaire, and that's kind of what the platform should be about. People using it to get their talent, use their talent to leverage that and to climb into a position of, I don't know, influence, or have a place where they can show what they want to say about the world, for example, rather than having the platform YouTube chase the kind of advertising money that comes with supporting kind of bigger businesses, for example. So, I mean, you can still think it's stupid, you can still think the videos are crap, and who really gives a, you know, who cares, like who comes out number one, but there's so many different angles to it that, I mean, it's not like, you know, super profound or complicated, but just shows like how lazily the media don't really report about it, you know. And then you get this guy who seems like a reasonably nice young man being labelled as a Nazi by everyone from J.K. Rowling to the Washington Post. So, you know, I just think as a kind of way to end the podcast, it's just like, I don't know, it's just it's crazy, like how much like false information is out there, and how much like character assassination there can be, and people also taking issues, like we talk about issues in our podcast like refugees or whatever, but we talk about these things because we're interested in them, but we get like journalists who kind of talk about them because they want to be superior to somebody else who doesn't think the same way that they do as well. So I think even this snapshot of this microcosm of this small corner of YouTube, this battle between him and this Indian company, kind of shows what's wrong with newspapers today. And it's very depressing. That's why like things like podcasts are, I think, increasing in popularity, because more people have access to it and can give their opinion. But then again, podcasts are going down the paid route as well, so maybe that will become more commercialized like YouTube as well. So anyway, there's not much more else to say about this, but you know, sometimes in part 3 we explore a topic in a microcosm. But that's coming to an end now, so you want to talk about Radio Public and why it's significant for our listeners and how they can participate with that.
You got it right, Radio Public.
Certainly did.
Yes, Radio Public. Listen to us on Radio Public, please. And that will help us a little bit with our finances.
Exactly. So if you listen to us on Radio Public, we get money for that. And you can find us on Instagram, Patreon, YouTube, Twitter, and our blog Irish Slice of Madrid. We'll link an article to that in the description as well. So, do you want to say Auf Wiedersehen?
Okay. Slam.
Tschüss. The Alarpa Podcast, the home for cultural chit-chat in and outside Madrid. People will talk.
I don't know what to say.
Neither do I.
Oh.
Okay. I did German once when I was in school. But
Did you?
I've forgotten it all now.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Alright. Okay. Apathetic altruism, or patriotic patriotism, and sink your teeth into the apple that you paid for. Songs sung not as often when they rhyme less. Choosing language over pictures caused a misconception. Right-handed leftists sneak into the press section. Bloody nose from the space heater. Broken clock above the sleeper sofa. Steamer trunk passed up, generational letdown. Overdose on gasoline, bus stop amphetamine, invasive alchemists, killing homegrown agriculture, historic snake oil, worth less than what you paid for, brownout, upcharge, cash cow in the sandbox, rich-ass banker buying boats for the landlocked. I don't know words, but I sure know how to speak them. I don't know people, so I fake it when I greet them.